Welcome to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. Today's guest is the Director of Communication for Golf Manitoba, as well as former voice of the Winnipeg Jets and the Manitoba Moose, Brian Munz. Brian, thanks so much for being on today's episode. I'm really glad to be able to talk puck with you.
No problem, Matthias. Good to catch up with you. How are you?
Doing excellent. I mean, maybe not as good as I could be with what happened the other night. The Jets, unfortunately, the valiant effort late at the end was not able to result in a win. But nonetheless, I think the Jets still do have quite a bit to be proud of with getting their first sweep in franchise history. But at the end of the day, Winnipeggers are most satisfied when Lord Stanley is residing in the province of Manitoba, which has not happened as of yet. But alas, we must wait one more year.
Yeah, you know what? I think Paul Maurice kind of summed it up last night after the game inside Bell Center, where he just alluded to the fact that the Canadians played better than what Winnipeg did in that 4-game series. Did the 8-day break hurt? Well, I guess right now you can say yes, because they had some pretty good momentum coming out of the Edmonton series, but couldn't carry it over. But I think at the end of the day, all the credit in the world goes to the Canadians right now. Carey Price was world class. Going back to his time when he won the Vezina, he was, and right now is playing like the best goaltender in the National Hockey League. So full credit to them. But you're right. I think it's a tough pill for a lot of people around Winnipeg and the province of Manitoba that have kind of ridden the emotions of the Jets here during the pandemic. And it's really been the release for everybody, right? Because of the lockdown and how things have gone. NHL hockey has kind of taken our minds off of it for the 2, 3, or 4 hours when the game went to triple overtime that night, where you don't have to kind of worry about the real world and you can focus on hockey. But they weren't the good enough team in the series, and they're done.
One of the things that was a common theme amongst issues with the Jets this series was people talking a lot about defense and how they weren't maybe as gritty as they were in the Edmonton series. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw with Winnipeg's defensive pairings and how they might have been able to remedy the situation in a future scenario going forward when they're playing in a tough series against Montreal with the way that they had performed?
Well, you lose a guy like Dylan DeMello. That is a huge blow, because not only do you have a veteran that's been around the league for a while, but you've got a steadying force back there. And, take nothing away from Tucker Poolman or a young guy like Logan Stanley, who got his first 2 Stanley Cup goals in the elimination game. But, experience means everything at this time of the year. The one difference for me going into this series, even before we got to game 1, as to how these clubs would match up, was the size that Marc Bergevin's been able to build on that Canadians blue line. And you take a look at Brandon native Joel Edmondson, you look obviously at their number 1 pairing, Ben Sherratt, who we're very familiar with here in Winnipeg. You've got their captain, Shea Weber. You've got Jeff Petrie. And then, their 5-6 guys, they kind of moved around a little bit, but their top 4 have some grit and some bite to them. And Winnipeg just couldn't really get a lot of second and third opportunities around Carey Price. And even in the elimination game, you look at the 16 shots they had, really nothing was in tight where there was a really scary scoring chance, other than the 2 goals that Logan Stanley scored, that, I thought Winnipeg was able to build any momentum on. So there's no doubt that I think that's going to be a big talking point again over the offseason here. It's kind of been the story over the last year and a half now, since Dustin Byfuglien and Tyler Myers and Jacob Trouba all left town. Is Winnipeg's defense core big enough to be able to compete when they need to get down to the nitty gritty in the Stanley Cup playoffs? They've obviously shown they can do it during the regular season, but as we've all learned, the regular season to the playoffs, and the deeper you go, is a much different story.
And especially with other common themes that are going to be questions raised in the offseason will revolve around the front office as well. You look at Paul Maurice, people are starting to question, have the Jets reached their peak with Maurice as the bench boss, or is there still room for them to grow? You mentioned the defense having been an issue for over the last year. Might that be part of the issue that the Jets were facing as compared to maybe what Paul Maurice was adding to the roster for this season? Because it's very difficult in these kind of scenarios where they had an amazing run against Edmonton, and now people are starting to point the finger at Paul saying, hey, it's your fault, or Maurice out because we lost. And who's the first person you got to get rid of when your team loses? Well, the coach, right? Montreal did that earlier in the year, and now they're in a deep playoff run, and maybe people are thinking, oh, well, The coaching change definitely helped, but I don't know. What do you think really plays the strongest factor in Winnipeg's performance for next year?
Well, I think obviously augmenting the roster, finding out who they're going to lose to Seattle in the expansion draft, how the free agency plays out leading into the start to a new season, and then, what they can do with their existing contracts right now. For me, Paul Maurice is not the problem with this team. He's one of the winningest coaches in Stanley Cup history right now, or regular season history for the Winnipeg Jets, pardon me. And yes, it has something to do with his longevity. And people are going to say, well, he's lost a bunch of games too, but he's been around for a long time. So you're going to win games, you're going to lose games. But, this coaching staff, and having been around them for the number of years that they were here, obviously Claude Noel, and it was a different staff when the team came here in 2011. But, being around the team for the last 6-7 years, whatever it's been since, Paul took over the helm, the coaching staff is not the issue here by any means. They just need their better players to step up at the right time of the year. And you look at the way this playoff series went, for whatever reason it was, and I don't like singling out the guy, and I'm not, but, it was a really quiet series against Montreal for Kyle Connor, who is one of the most gifted scorers in Canada. If you want to look at the Scotia North Division right now, we've been able to watch what he's been able to do. Pierre-Luc Dubois, I think he was hurt, and I don't know, maybe we'll hear more as the week goes on. Maybe we won't, depending how the Jets want to handle it. But, I talked to a couple people around the league, and one guy specifically in Columbus that is close to the Blue Jackets organization. And the text back and forth over the last few days was, what's wrong with PLD? Because this doesn't look like him, the way he played when he was a Blue Jacket compared to what he is right now for the Winnipeg Jets. So I think Pierre-Luc is hurt. Again, that's just my thoughts. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe he just had a bad series. But that's kind of the way I look at it right now from what the expectation was when they made the Patrick Laine deal. And then, you lose Mark Scheifele in 2 consecutive years in the playoffs. Obviously, he got hurt in the bubble last year, and then he gets himself suspended this year. Doesn't hurt or doesn't help when your number one center iceman is not a factor for you in the game. So somehow he's got to learn to stay in the playoff series here when the Jets get into the important time of the season. So all in all, there was, kind of a lot of mitigating circumstances here that led to Winnipeg being ousted and not advancing into the Final Four.
Mark Scheifele being such a key centerman for the Jets, last 2 years having missed almost all their playoff series that they were up against Calgary, and then this year him not being able to play against Montreal because of suspension. What say you about the hit? Do you believe that it was clean, or do you believe that they warranted a suspension, or do you think that the suspension was too long and it should have been shorter?
No, it was a suspension for sure. It was a terrible hit. I was sitting right above it inside the rink. Now, should it have been 4 games? I don't know if I'd go that far, but there's no doubt that, there's contact with the head. And, you can argue this every which way until the next regular season begins. And I think everybody's going to do it that follows the Jets and is around the National Hockey League. But there's no doubt in my mind that, that's a suspension that Mark Scheifele should have had. The number of games, that's up to player safety. And they don't have an easy job to try and manage those things right now. So, guaranteed he should have got 2 games, no question about it. But as you look at it, Montreal lost a top 6 forward in Jake Evans as well, and he wasn't an option for the rest of the series either. So, both teams ended up losing a top 6 forward, and Montreal's depth and rest of their players were able to handle it much better than Winnipeg's were.
And that's a great point that you made, because Evans also wasn't able to play for Montreal, and people may have looked past that because they were so focused on the buzz around Scheifele and all the controversy that surrounded the length of the suspension. Should there have been a suspension? Paul Maurice's comments on it being a heavy but clean hit. In my opinion, when I saw it in regular motion the next day, I woke up and I saw it. I was like, that looked really bad. It looked bad. Yeah. Even if you can say it's clean, or you can say, oh, this is playoff hockey, whatever, but it's the ref's hands are tied when, especially when a guy is concussed or doesn't get back up off on his own power from the ice. it's really, really hard to say that that doesn't warrant any suspension at all. Now, again, 4 games, maybe a bit much, maybe 2 would have been better. But at the end of the day, I think in that scenario, maybe Scheifele in the future would think twice about lighting a guy up, even if it meant that they might bury the empty netter, because you'd rather get back the next game while he's able to play rather than miss him for a potential sweep, which is what ended up happening.
Yeah, and like you look at his track record, and we're not running Mark Scheifele out of town by any means. He's a huge piece to this hockey club moving forward, and will be for years to come here. Right now, he's an elite player. He's one of the top 30 players in the NHL, in my opinion, for sure, when you take a look at all the teams across the league. But this is a learning, kind of situation for him. And it's tough that it was 4 games. There's no doubt. Like, I'm sure he was pretty much sick about the fact that he couldn't play in these series based on his love of the game. And, I've been around him since day one. He's in the National Hockey League, and everybody kind of calls him the hockey nerd. And respectfully, that's what he is, right? Like, he lives and breathes the game of hockey, and nobody wants to be, a better hockey player than Mark Scheifele, and the time and the effort and all the resources that he has that he puts into the game. But he made a mistake, and you know what? Had to pay for it, and unfortunately, that was part of Winnipeg falling in this series. So I guess at the end of the day, and kind of moving forward from that now, is we all hope that, if that situation were to ever play out again, that he doesn't make that same mistake, because again, he's not a dirty hockey player. You look at his track record, his penalty minutes are pretty much minuscule, and he's had no major suspensions come his way prior to. So there's a lot of other players you'd be more concerned about, but I'm not worried about Mark moving forward on this. Once he gets through now, he's obviously going to have to serve the next game on the suspension too when the regular season begins. But when the Jets get ready for game 2 of their next season, you can guarantee that 55 will be ready to go for sure.
Absolutely. And Mark Scheifele, you mentioned having known him from day one. Not long ago, it was within the last 2 weeks that it was the decade anniversary of the Jets being announced that they were going to come back to Winnipeg. Yep. It's just so crazy to think how much time has passed since. It almost felt like yesterday that I was in 9th grade and listening to the announcement over the PA at St. Paul's around 3 o'clock, I think it was, or 2:45. And that Mark Shipman had purchased the Atlanta Thrashers and they were moving the vans up to Winnipeg, Manitoba. What was that day like for you? Because you worked with the Moose, you've been in Winnipeg for quite some time, and them receiving an NHL franchise again after the devastating exit that had happened prior in 1996 after losing 6 games to the Detroit Red Wings. Talk about what that day meant for you as a hockey fan and also as a professional.
Yeah, it was interesting because obviously being in Winnipeg for the 5 prior years with the Manitoba Moose and calling the games on CJOB, it was, everybody, wherever you went, and NHL scouts would always come in and you'd see NHL management, you'd talk to different people in the NHL, and they always looked at the Manitoba Moose as kind of at that point, the 31st franchise in the NHL. Like Mark Chipman, Craig Heisinger, at that point, Claude Noel, Scott Arniel prior to Randy Carlyle, the list goes on and on. Like from top to bottom, they ran the Moose like an NHL franchise. And if it weren't for the Moose, the NHL wouldn't be here today. There's no question about that whatsoever. So when you look back at it, like a lot of people thought at one point, the Arizona or the Phoenix Coyotes at that point would eventually come back to Winnipeg, and it didn't turn out that way. And it was Atlanta, as we all know now in the story. But, that day for me was kind of intriguing because in the off season, how it worked hockey wise is I'd do the morning sports at CJOB, and Bob Irving was busy covering the Blue Bombers. And then we'd kind of make that switch in the winter time where he'd be in the radio station and I'd be at the hockey rink. So I was doing morning sports that morning, and Scott Brown, their media and PR guy, gave me a call early in the morning saying, hey, a heads up, you can't go with anything yet on the air, but it looks like this is going to happen. And then it was, just that excitement because there was so many rumors and such talk about it. And, all the networks had been in town for a few days. I was doing some freelance stuff with Arash Madani on Sportsnet. And, the buzz was there, but you just didn't kind of know when the whole thing was going to play out. And then obviously when it did that morning, it was awesome. Like really, so we're on CJOB for the morning, talking about, hey, there's going to be an announcement coming up at that point, I guess, what was MTS Center, now Bell MTS Place. So we all, made our way down to the arena, and in one of the big areas underneath the stands there by what's now the visitors dressing room area, and where the off-ice officials gather before the games now for NHL games. That's where they held the media conference, and Gary Bettman and Bill Daly made the announcement, and Mr. Thompson was in town, obviously, a big part of the ownership group with Mark Chipman. And as they say, the rest is history. And it's been quite a wild ride for sure over the last 10 years. And you're right that even like you think of Mark Scheifele coming into the organization, then a month and a half or whatever it was later, we're all going down to Minnesota. And it couldn't have worked better, because a 6 or 7 hour drive down the highway, you're getting a chance to go to the NHL draft, where Winnipeg's NHL franchise is going to be named something. We didn't know if it was going to be the Jets as of yet. You didn't know who they were going to pick. So there were so many unanswered questions going into the XL Energy Center for that. And, that weekend was fantastic that, kind of everything came to life. And I guess leaving the hotel, I was in a van with Mark Chipman and Scott Brown and a few of the other at that point True North employees or Jets employees now. And it was starting to come out that the name was going to be Winnipeg Jets, and I was sworn to secrecy at that point, that couldn't say anything for a couple of hours, and held my end of the bargain. And then obviously Mark went up to the podium and said, hey, on behalf of the Winnipeg Jets, and there was a great buzz in the building. And then we all had to find out who Mark Scheifele was, because there were a lot of names on the board that I think we all did our homework on, and we kind of knew who Scheifele was, but when you see the way it's spelt, you weren't exactly sure on the pronunciation and the entire background. But obviously Dale Howardchuk and his connection there with the Barrie Colts was a big reason why Mark came here. And the legend of 55 began that day when he put on the black NHL jersey, because the Jets jerseys weren't there yet. He had the black hat and the black jersey and threw that on, and away we go.
Just such a wild ride to think about how long it's been and what they had to go through in that weekend. You describe all the different things about the story, whether it's the fact they didn't know what the team name was going to be. I still remember having conversations, and there was a lot of speculation around, would it be Jets? Would it be another name? People were thinking, looking at the jersey behind me, are they going to use the same logo from the 90s, or are they going to use a new logo? That was a question I was asking. And then when Scheifele was drafted, people were like, who is he? Is he going to be really good? Or are we just saying that because he's the first pick of our inaugural season? There was so much buzz in Winnipeg that has, maybe it's had a bit of a dip in the last few years because of that initial buzz kind of wearing off. But needless to say, the passion for hockey, especially NHL hockey in Winnipeg, is still very alive and well. I must ask though, and maybe there was speculation, or maybe it was already well known and I'm just not aware. Was Atlanta, like, had they declared that they were selling the franchise or was up for sale, or were people unsure what the announcement was going to be? Or was it like, okay, Atlanta's selling, we know that Winnipeg's probably trying to buy it, or how did that whole deal shake down? Because Atlanta had the Flames previously, so this was their second go.
Yeah, you know what? How everything exactly played out behind the scenes, I don't know if anybody knows, or if when the whole deal came to fruition that it was going to be the Thrashers. I think that's more of an NHL behind the scenes kind of thing. But there was no doubt that leading into those 3 or 4 days before, again, I mentioned that all the big major networks were in town that we're all used to being a part of now, but back in the day when Sportsnet and TSN were coming in here to spend some time, it was a big deal, because TSN was in for CFL football with the Blue Bombers. You didn't see anything Sportsnet wise. I was their freelance guy if something was going on with the Bombers, or the odd story with the Manitoba Moose, if there was maybe some connection there with the Vancouver Canucks. There was really no real what's the way to say it? There was really no national flavor here inside Winnipeg. Like Sarah Oleski, of course, was TSN's Winnipeg bureau person, and she was still in Toronto at that point, coming back to Winnipeg if something was ever going to happen. So again, like we were kind of just little old Winnipeg here, right? We had the Bombers, we had the Moose, we had the Gold Eyes, and we all just kind of were living the dream one day of maybe having an NHL franchise come. And then when it did, obviously everything changed, and the sports media landscape changed, and TSN radio was born, and we became legitimate. Like, you think of the sports that are here in Winnipeg now and compare it to the other cities across Canada. Other than Toronto, you can't, right? Because you've got, they've got the Blue Jays. Like, we don't have a Major League Baseball team, but we've got, from a football standpoint, the Blue Bombers. You've got the Rifles, the junior football team. You've got the Bisons, the university team. Hockey-wise, you've got the NHL. You've got the American Hockey League. You've got the MJHL. You've got the Western Hockey League now. You've got Junior A, Triple A, and then it goes all the way down the list. You've got the Bisons again in Canada West. Then you've got the Gold Eyes. So per capita and based on sports, there's no better city to be in than what Winnipeg has. Like, none of these other cities can claim everything that we have right now based on what they have, except for Toronto. So we've come a long way here in the last decade or so that that might get forgotten sometimes, that people should be pretty proud of if you're a sports fan, for sure. And real quick, back to the jersey, you mentioned kind of what the name was going to be, and I'll admit it. I wanted them to be called the Manitoba Moose, and that's maybe the heartstrings of the guy that called their games for 5 years and had so many deep connections with the coaching staff and the players and the training staff that like, we had a tight group for those 5 years. And obviously the Calder Cup run in 2009 was something that I'll never forget, eventually, when they unfortunately fell to Hershey. But I love those Moose jerseys. Like, the color scheme, I still think, is one of the best looks that's out there in a hockey jersey itself. So I was kind of pulling for the Moose. And then the polar bear name was one that obviously was getting a lot of play as well. And we've seen a little bit of that right now with the current incarnation of the Manitoba Moose. So those were kind of the three names that were being bantied around all the way through. But I think there was some pretty big excitement, and we see how it's gone now a decade later, obviously, that they made the right decision calling them the Jets.
Absolutely. And it makes sense in continuity wise. I don't think that any other team name would have suited Winnipeg quite like the Jets. Maybe the Moose, Manitoba Moose. You mentioned that now. It definitely would have fit really nicely. You also mentioned them being like the 31st franchise of the NHL at the time. And that would have been quite interesting to think about if they would have just moved the Moose up to the NHL. But again, I think fans are just as satisfied with having the Jets back in town, especially considering the fact that it had been so long, 15 years without your NHL franchise, and not knowing if they would ever come back. Because you look at people in the city of Quebec, how close they came a few times there, and then poof, they vanished off to Colorado, and now people in the city of Quebec sit there in purgatory, not knowing if they're ever going to get an NHL franchise back. And that is definitely one of the hottest topics of debate in terms of Canadian hockey outside of the NHL. But where do you stand on the whole Quebec City should have a team? How could Seattle get a franchise, or how could they try to have these teams in the Southern US where they don't care about hockey? Now, obviously I understand the money and trying to grow the game of hockey to other markets, because people still in Quebec City obviously love the NHL no matter what. But is there a possibility that Quebec City could ever return?
Well, I think there's always a chance, right? Like, that's why you do anything in life. There's always an opportunity for you down the road. It doesn't make sense economically. Does it work out geographically? Is there a franchise that needs to move, or do they add another expansion team like they're doing with the Seattle Kraken? I don't know how much more the NHL wants to expand past 32 teams, because how many teams are the right number before, I don't want to say you water down the product, but how many is too many, I guess, would kind of be my question in that regard. And the notion is there that people don't care about hockey in the US and in the South and some of those non-traditional hockey markets, as you can say. I've been to all of those places numerous times now over the last 9 years. They care. Like, there's some of the most passionate fans in some of the places that you wouldn't expect to see, that are there all the time. Are they sold out all the time? No, they're not. Like, obviously Florida gets a lot of headline. Arizona gets a lot of headline. There's some empty seats in Anaheim, and there's some empty seats in Los Angeles, and some of those places. Dallas is such a big arena that every time the Stars play, it's not going to be sold out. But those locations are part of the NHL, and it would be disappointing to see any of those teams now leave. And then you watch what some of the other franchises like Nashville and Vegas are doing right now. That if somehow they can lift the roof off and add another 10,000 people into the building, that it probably wouldn't be a bad idea with how popular their sport is right now. But you can't, so it's just kind of an off-topic conversation there right now. But hockey's big in the U.S., and again, you're seeing it even from the television contract with how much money that is being spent here in the off season moving forward right now. That it's big money. It's a big money sport down in the U.S., just like the other major sports like football and baseball and basketball and everything else.
And to see ESPN acquire the rights to have NHL games broadcast again for the first time in a long time really does speak volumes to the point you're making about how much more popular hockey has become in America. And you're right. You look at some of those places, Florida is always getting the bad rap of, oh, well, look at the, people may not know that the picture was taken 3 hours before, puck drop. Oh, look how empty the arena is, or look how empty the arena is in Phoenix. And I can't, Jets fans before licking their chops, waiting for the Arizona Coyotes to collapse so they can return rightfully so to Winnipeg. But you are right. You look at when those teams start to get good, when the fans start showing up. Florida was a good team this year. Obviously, the Lightning have a lot more playoff experience. And Arizona, while they maybe haven't been the best, they've had a few good years here and there. And Dallas, you mentioned Dallas, although they may not sell out, I think Dallas have some of the most passionate fans for hockey in all the Southern U.S. And the Kings have done their fair share. It is popular. I think maybe people have it a bit misconstrued.
Well, and don't forget too, like you use the example of Florida, and hey, I've been in that rink a few times where there might have been 8,000 or 9,000 people in the building, but you've got a day, much like we're living with here in Manitoba right now, where it's 25 or 30 degrees. You're going to go watch a number of games, but you're not going to go every night. And if you've got a chance to go play golf, or you've got a chance to sit on the beach in Fort Lauderdale, some nights you're going to pick to not go to the hockey rink and maybe watch it on TV. But at the end of the day, though, they've got the base, they've got the corporate support there right now, which is most important. And if they're able to build some momentum, because you're right, they were really good this year. Not a lot of people saw it just based on the way that the schedule worked out. And I think for the most part, everybody north of the border was kind of focused here on the Scotia North Division, that they kind of turned their attention away from some of those other U.S. teams that we'll start to watch again, maybe more in September and October. But they've got a good club down there that's going to make some noise for a little while for sure.
So if you get the opportunity to go down and be a broadcaster for the Panthers, how tempted will you be to go golf in Fort Lauderdale instead of be at the arena night in, night out?
Well, you can't miss game days, but the odd optional skate, there could possibly be an option for the broadcasters. And I know the guys down there that love to play golf, but you know what? That's all part of it here too right now. So there's perks for everywhere that you live, no matter where you are, for sure.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that it's a pretty good scenario down in the Southern US. I honestly wouldn't mind having the nice weather almost all year round and still getting an NHL franchise. Then you get a little bit of the best of both worlds. But I want to ask you specifically about your experience when you were in Edmonton. So you had worked with the AHL franchise, but also for 1 year in 05-06 had hosted Oilers games throughout the year on the radio. Not 05-06 year was the year that they went on a magical run that unfortunately ended in a Game 7 loss to Carolina Hurricanes. I want to know, what was that playoff run like from your firsthand account? Because I didn't even know how crazy it was, because growing up as a kid, I didn't really follow hockey. And then doing research back on it now, it's wild that they came so close, and being an 8th seed and the way in which they won. What was that whole experience like, that playoff, that during those Stanley Cup playoffs in 05-06 in Edmonton?
Well, you used the right word. It was magical. Like it was crazy, because the 2 years I was there, so I'd done junior hockey in Saskatchewan all my life. And the lockout year in 04-05, Edmonton decided that they were going to play their team in Edmonton. They were in Toronto, the Roadrunners, and it was late. Like the Western Hockey League season was already underway. I was beginning my 5th year with the Prince Albert Raiders. And when it was announced they were going to have a team, they needed a guy. And I thought, you know what the heck? I'm just going to throw my name in there and just see how it goes. I loved it in PA. I had no reason to leave, but thought, you know what, if there's a chance to get into pro hockey, why not, go out on a limb and see what it's like. So, lo and behold, long story short, I got the job. So my first opportunity to work in pro hockey in Edmonton, calling Roadrunner games in what was then Rexall Place, the old rink that had all the glory years of the Oilers winning the Stanley Cups, was awesome. Like it was being a kid from Saskatchewan, you're in Edmonton, I'm still close to home, and you're getting a chance to call pro hockey. And Jarrett Stoll and Rafi Torres were on the team from the Oilers. The Oiler management, the coaching staff were around every day because, there was no NHL hockey. So they were there. So it was kind of like a coffee shop every morning. The little radio booth that we worked out of all the time was connected right beside the dressing room. So again, like literally Craig McTavish and Charlie Huddy and Craig Simpson and, the whole staff. Kevin Lowe was the GM. Like we all just hung out. Like it was awesome. So had the year with the American Hockey League club. And then to fast forward to the next year, they decided that they weren't going to have both teams there, and they offered me a chance to do pre and post on radio with Rod Phillips and Morley Scott, who were the two legendary voices of Oiler hockey at that point. And I jumped on it, right? Because, okay, here's my chance now to go into the NHL and see what it was like. And it was like, I don't know how to put it into words for a kid that had never seen it, because they built a good team. Nobody expected them that year, though, to go to the Stanley Cup final. And there was a lot of hype around Edmonton because they brought in Chris Pronger and they brought in Michael Pekka that off season. So they brought in two really big names to augment Ryan Smith. And I mentioned Stoll and Torres before, and they had UC Markin as their goalie, and Jason Smith was their captain, and I could run down the whole list for you. And they were a good team during the year, but again, nobody kind of expected. And then when they got Dwayne Rollison, it was kind of like, okay, like this club, if they get in, could do something. And then lo and behold, I think it was the second or third last game of the regular season, they were able to clinch, and Edmonton just went crazy. Now, you talked about it. They were an 8th seed, and going up against first seeded Detroit, I think everybody kind of thought it was going to be a quick series. And that was Steve Yzerman's last year with the Red Wings. So there were a lot of memories from that series, obviously, and they were able to knock off Detroit. Then they went on to play San Jose in round 2, were expected to win that series. They advanced to Anaheim, play the Ducks in the Western Conference final, win that series in Anaheim. I'll never forget that night, just with the excitement of being on the road and knowing that you're going to the Stanley Cup final. And then obviously, as you mentioned, they lost in 7 to Carolina, but I think we'll see it here too. As soon as a Canadian club loses, it kind of seems like every other Canadian club eventually, when they get over it, kind of jump on board and want the Stanley Cup to be north of the border. And that's the way it was in Edmonton. Like, not only as crazy busy as it was doing the Oiler broadcast, but I was probably doing 10 interviews a day on other radio stations, not only in Canada, but the US as well, because everybody wanted to find out what it was like to be in that arena. And when you look at the old video now, and I've got a couple of DVDs in the basement of how, they did the pre-game intro, the in-arena stuff. And then just looking back, like that building was magic, kind of like what Bell MTS Place is now. When the Jets went into, that series against Nashville, and then the home games against Vegas too. Like it's absolutely bonkers. You can't hear yourself think. So it was really special. My 2 years were awesome. There's no doubt about it that, other than them winning Game 7, it couldn't have been any better.
And the way that I actually came across that, interesting, you talk about how bonkers the building was. was a video. I was scrolling through TikTok and all of a sudden I saw this gentleman with the mic and said, "In all thy son's command." And the second he lifted and stopped singing, and you heard "with glowing," just like as if the stadium was on a PA system, like the arena was on a PA system. Like it was like, it almost had me in tears, honestly. It was just so remarkable to watch. And I was thinking to myself, this is Edmonton. You imagine the Stanley Cup final was in Winnipeg? Ooh, especially now. Oh my goodness. I don't even know. Like that would just send chills down my spine. But it just goes to show like how important it is for Canadian teams. I know that people in Toronto, there's a little clip on Twitter I saw today about the CN Tower being lit up with red, white, and blue, and people saying, "Oh, you should be shot," or "That's crazy to think that Toronto would support Montreal being in the conference finals." But when was the last time a Canadian team won? When Montreal won in 93. So I get the rivalry and stuff, but I think when a team like Montreal gets a chance on the run they're having, sometimes you got to just set aside the allegiance and hope that we can all collectively celebrate in a Stanley Cup victory being back within our borders.
Well, the one way you look at it is, don't you want to lose to the champion? Like, as much as it sucks for everybody in Winnipeg to say, yeah, we got swept in 4 and it's over. And, I wish that our team, quote unquote, our team is what Winnipeg fans would look at it as. I think there's something that if the Canadians were to win the Stanley Cup, I'd be thrilled for Ben Sherratt, one of the greatest human beings there is. And again, if things were different and the Dustin Byfuglien situation would have went or was handled a different way by Buff himself, I think Ben Sherratt would still be a Winnipeg Jet today. But it just didn't work out. That it looked like they were going to have too many guys here and couldn't make it work. For Joel Armia, for Joel Edmondson, I think it'd be awesome for Carey Price just for the NHL to win a Stanley Cup. So they've got a lot of people there that I really like in that Montreal organization. So I would root for them. But I've also obviously got some allegiance with Colorado and Vegas too. So I don't know which way to go when we get there. I guess we got to find out to see who Montreal is playing, and then it'll come down to a really must-watch situation for what'll be the Western Conference Final that Montreal is going to play in. But everything's a little bit skewed here in this COVID year for sure.
What are your thoughts on the Scotia North Division going forward after the season? Do you think it's something that might stick around, or do you think that it's gotta be a product of its time for this year?
Yeah, I don't think there's any chance it's going to stick around. I think there's an opportunity though to play more games against each other, and I guess that's a conversation too. Like, how many games do you take away from, let's say, your division, or do you play those Eastern Conference teams maybe once? Like, one year, do you go to Pittsburgh, and then the next year, do they come here? Well, then, people, if he's hurt or something would happen, like you couldn't see Sidney Crosby maybe for 3 years or 2 years, right? So there's lots of pros and cons to the whole thing, but I think there is an appetite though to maybe get 1 or 2 more games against those Canadian clubs for all the Canadian teams, because it was fun. I think by the time we got to maybe games 8, 9, and 10 in the situations when they played Toronto and Ottawa, that it got to be a little bit much, because, I miss seeing the other teams that we were so used to watching. And I'll admit it, like, I've got so many friends that are on, Minnesota, Colorado, Nashville, Dallas, teams that you see all the time, Chicago. Jeremy Colleton is their head coach, Sheldon Brookbanks, their assistant. I called their games when they were playing junior hockey. So, you love seeing those guys, but when they aren't on the radar for the team that you're watching every night and covering, then you do kind of lose track. So it was odd to kind of wrap your head around that, but I'm excited to kind of see how the new schedule comes into play, and then what's going to happen with Seattle too, right? Like, that's a new franchise coming in, and everybody's going to want to see the Kraken in their first NHL season for sure.
That is an interesting place for the next expansion franchise in the NHL, Seattle. I always thought that there was rummagings maybe of Houston or something a few years back, but now Seattle, while it would be pretty cool for the NBA to return there, I think the NHL will find a nice home in Seattle. It seems like they've already been pretty innovative with the way that they've been setting up the organization and the arena, and to see what may come of the next expansion franchise, we all know what happened with Vegas. Everyone was expecting them 30 wins tops, nothing else. Run all the way to the finals, playing what became a runaway series, but was pretty close in that game 2 when Holtby made the unbelievable save. But what do you think will come of Seattle in their first few years? Do you think that it might be a Vegas situation and they spark a lot of momentum, or do you think that it'll follow more in line with the other expansion franchises who have struggled for the first few years?
Well, I think they're definitely going to be competitive and above, because the work that Ron Francis and his staff behind the scenes have done already. You think of the scouting staffs that have been out to watch so many games over the last 2 years. They're prepared on who they want to take. Now it's just a matter. The one thing that I'll say, though, is, George McPhee and Kelly McCrimmon kind of had this thing brand new where they were able to make a lot of moves and move a lot of things into their favor. I don't know if, Ron and that Seattle staff is going to be able to have as much success maneuvering the other teams like Vegas did. So that could be a little bit different. But, I spent some time in Seattle, obviously, when I was calling Western Hockey League games. One of my best friends from high school lives there and have spent some time there. Seattle's an unbelievable city. And it's going to be pretty cool for people to get a chance to go there and watch that team play in the Pacific Northwest. It's obviously a great rivalry for Vancouver, literally being 2 hours pretty much from doorstep to doorstep, rink to rink, where they'll be able to go back and forth. So that'll be fun to watch how that grows. And just to have another team on the West Coast too, I think it's going to help out the California teams in Arizona and Vegas. It's a perfect fit.
For sure. And you mentioned that rivalry with Vancouver is going to be huge, because Vancouver, obviously being the sole Canadian team that is hanging out along the West Coast, playing against a lot of teams from California. Also Edmonton and Calgary getting a bit of a taste with some of the Western teams, with how lopsided the NHL is dispersed across the East. Definitely very fascinated by what opportunities may come for Seattle in terms of competition, because with how Vegas performed, it now makes you wonder, well, what was done differently, and maybe how is Seattle trying to model their franchise or the innovative methods they're going to use in a different way so that they can also find similar success. Maybe not go all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals in year 1, but Seattle, I think, will be a good market for an NHL franchise. And I am as well excited to see how they fare in their first NHL season. And it'll also just be nice for there to be even balance. Looking at every other major 4 league, they have 32 or 30 teams, not in between. And now there will finally be 32 teams in the NHL. They won't have to worry about the Pacific Division being one short of the others. So I think that it'll be a good venture overall, and I'm excited to see what the Kraken are able to do. In terms of your experience as a hockey fan, though, I must know, because you grew up in Saskatchewan, and this is a question I'm sure you've probably gotten a few times in your life. With there being no NHL franchise that Saskatchewan citizens have a specific allegiance to, who did you follow growing up? Was it the Oilers? Was it the Flames? Was it the Jets because of proximity, or did you follow a completely different team?
Well, for me, I was born in Regina and I was there until grade 8. So the Western Hockey League was kind of my NHL. Like, you'd watch it on Saturday night, you'd get the odd Wednesday night game and that kind of stuff. But you got to remember, then every game wasn't available on television or on your phone or your laptop where you were. So the NHL was a little bit more appointment viewing at that point. Mike Sillinger was the star of the Regina Pats when I was a kid growing up, and he got drafted by Detroit. So as that kind of moved along, I was a bit of a Red Wing fan. And then kind of in that same window when Sillinger was there with the Pats, we moved to Humboldt, and that was right kind of around the Mike Modano era with the Prince Albert Raiders. And I became a big fan of his. And then obviously when he went to Minnesota and then in Dallas, I was a really big Stars fan. And, we spent a lot of time at the lake in northern Saskatchewan. Dave Manson was there. He'd come back over the summertime. You'd see him kind of running around the lake area. And I just kind of gravitated more to some individual players than maybe the team themselves. But if I had to pick a team, I would say it was Dallas. Just with the Modano factor, and then a few other players that were pretty good on that team as well. And then obviously when they won the cup in '99, I was locked right into them until I became the voice of the Jets, and I had to obviously change my allegiance a little bit inside the Central Division. But I'd say that's the team for me as an NHL fan growing up. It was the Minnesota then / Dallas Stars.
That's really interesting because I know that people in Saskatchewan will usually, like, especially in around the era of people were watching during the time that Gretzky was winning all the Stanley Cups at Edmonton, or when the Flames won in '89, or the Jets even being good in the mid '80s there for a little bit, that it would just be easy to jump on the bandwagon with one of those three teams. But I never thought about it from the perspective of the Western Hockey League being so popular that
Yep.
it almost overrides people watching NHL hockey in Saskatchewan because it's so popular locally that it is like the NHL there. And that there are so many teams, despite how small some of the towns are, that it's not something to be overlooked, especially when during that time, it isn't like the present day where you can easily access NHL games or NHL League Pass on your phone and watch every game at once on 32 screens. So you grew up in Regina, big Pats fan. Then what's the strongest rivalry that the Regina Pats have in the Western Hockey League?
Oh, it's Moose Jaw for sure. There's some epic battles between the Pats and the Warriors. There's no question there. But really, Matthias, like it was so much different then. And now I feel like I'm a 90-year-old guy telling old folk stories here. But you're right, because like even radio wise, like the NHL games weren't available on radio in Saskatchewan until they got to the Stanley Cup playoffs. And then, NHL radio would go on to CKOM or CJME or CKRM, like one of the big radio stations that kind of boomed across the province. And then, you'd start to get a little bit of taste of Stanley Cup playoff action, but you wouldn't hear NHL hockey on the radio at all. It was junior hockey. And that for me is kind of what got my juices going, being a young guy thinking, okay, you know what? I can achieve this of hopefully calling junior hockey somewhere. And starting in the Saskatchewan Junior Hockey League, or the year even before in the BC Junior League, I went to Cowichan Valley, which is in Duncan, BC. And like, that was the greatest thing ever, because again, the Canucks are big out there, but your region you're in on Vancouver Island, people are watching Canuck games, but they're more focused on what's going on with the Cowichan Valley Capitals and the Victoria Salsa and the Nanaimo Clippers and the Powell River Paper Kings and, that whole kind of deal. And then it kind of just stayed on that same whole area for me, where after that, getting into the Saskatchewan Junior League, like we talk about a Regina Moose Jaw rivalry, it was the same in the SJHL, where you had Melfort and Humboldt and Nipawin and North Battleford and Kindersley. Like, when you saw a Friday, Saturday back-to-back that the Humboldt Broncos and the Melfort Mustangs were playing, like the whole town was buzzing about it. And then you were getting to come in and call those games, which, for me at that point meant the world to me in my career and still does here today. So as much as we get excited about, watching the Jets and the Minnesota Wild rivalry build, or one now with the Vegas Golden Knights or the Nashville Predators, in my day, those junior hockey rivalries were as big or maybe even a little bit bigger, just because the other outlets weren't there to watch NHL hockey.
And I'm sure that a lot of the lifeblood of those rivalries still exists, very, very strongly today, even though the NHL is very easily accessible.
Oh, for sure.
For people across Saskatchewan. And you look at the Regina Pats this year with what Connor Bedard did for them and what he's been able to do on the national stage as well. Just a fantastic player. And it always makes you think twice for people who are from outside Saskatchewan or maybe even outside Canada that, hey, the Western Hockey League is, it's no slouch of a league, and it's definitely nothing to scoff at, especially with some of those teams in Saskatchewan, right? They produce some of the toughest and most skilled players in the National Hockey League. And as much as it pains me to say this being from Winnipeg, but, Saskatchewan is definitely a force to be reckoned with on the professionals and, across the whole professional sports landscape in North America.
Well, and let's not forget about the two teams that are in Manitoba here right now too. Like the Brandon Wheat Kings won the East this year in the bubble in Regina, and the job that, the Winnipeg Ice have been able to do in building their franchise, bringing them in here from Cranbrook, the Kootenay Ice now to the Winnipeg Ice. Like, there's some very, very special, talented players that are both on the ice in the Wheat Kings. So they may not get the headlines as much as the Jets and the Bombers do with the daily press around the city of Winnipeg here. But, junior hockey, it's a moniker they've used for years, is the stars of tomorrow. And that's exactly what it is. And again, for me, like I talked about Sillinger and Medano and Manson and players like that, like for younger people, they gravitate to a player like that. And then, they're good when they're in junior because, it's a God-given ability and they work at it. But then when you watch them on their career, like think of a guy like Braden Schneider with, what he did with the Wheat Kings, plays for the World Juniors, gets a chance to win a gold medal, didn't really play at the World Championship, but has more Hockey Canada hardware. Peyton Krebs here with the Winnipeg Ice, like he's going to be a really good Vegas Golden Knight for a long time. So, it's exciting to watch, for me anyway, a guy that grew up with junior hockey, to be able to watch these young players develop into grown men. And you think of the players now, like we talked about Mark Scheifele earlier on, guarantee there's fans of the Barrie Colts that are Winnipeg Jet fans right now because of Mark Scheifele. And the list goes on and on with all these guys that have played junior hockey along the way.
And I'm so glad that they did bring a WHL franchise to Winnipeg. You talk about how great the Ice have done in such a short amount of time. And there was questions I heard around the community of people saying things like, oh, well, there's too many hockey teams in Manitoba, or this town ain't big enough for the both of us. And they're talking about the Wheat Kings and the Ice, or what's going to happen to the Blues. But the job they've done so far to really unify all the high level hockey teams in Winnipeg, I think is fantastic, because there really isn't, there's not enough hockey. Sometimes it seems in this province for all the people that love the sport in Winnipeg, especially with getting the NHL back and then getting a WHL team. It's awesome. And I really am glad to see how well the Ice have done in such a short amount of time. And with them playing at the Bison's Arena and then being able to move up to their own facility, I'm really excited for the future of junior hockey in Manitoba, especially in Winnipeg, now that there can be that Brandon-Winnipeg rivalry. But Brian, we're getting towards the end of our time, and I wanted to ask you one final wrap-up question that will conclude today's episode. So besides Gordie Howe, who in your opinion is the best Saskatchewan-born NHL player ever?
Ooh, you took the easy answer out.
Of course, because then it's a shoo-in. But besides him,
Wendell Clark.
And
Pride and joy of Kelvington.
And why do you choose Wendell Clark?
He did everything. Like you think of his time as a Maple Leaf, you think of his time as all over where he played in the NHL. You knew exactly what you were getting. So for me, being a tough farm guy from Saskatchewan, it was obviously a guy that everybody was really excited to have. And, I got to see a little bit of his career. Like I was younger, obviously, then when he played for the Saskatoon Blades. But I would probably say that Wendell would be the number two just off the top of my head. But, deep in my heart, I'd probably give you the Mike Sillinger, Dave Manson answer too, because those were my two Saskatchewan guys growing up.
Wendell Clark is very deserving to be that number two. Of course, even for someone like myself, just hearing the name Gordie Howe, you don't nickname someone Mr. Hockey for no reason. But I've always wondered that, people talk about how amazing there are of players from Saskatchewan in the NHL, and that there's a lot more of them per capita based on the province's population compared to maybe some other places in Canada. But again, there can be a lot of debate around who that number two spot is, but I think Wendell Clark is the appropriate answer for today. So with that, Brian, I want to thank you for having me on today's episode. I really enjoyed talking hockey with you. It was great to reminisce about the history of Jets 2.0 coming back, what's going on with the Jets here in the next coming off season. And it was great to really uncover some of those stories and memories that you have from what's been an amazing career so far working in the NHL.
Appreciate the time, Matthias. Happy to do it. And let's catch up again soon. Take care.
All right. Well, that sounds great, Brian. And thank you for listening to today's episode with the Director of Communications for Gulf Manitoba and sports broadcaster, Brian Munz.